Good afternoon. I'm Lucy Lang, the director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We're a collaborative national platform that brings together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to build a criminal legal system that promotes community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. Please follow us at IIP_John Jay and at prosecution.org, and consider joining us next Tuesday at 11 a.m. for a Pride Month discussion about LGBTQ+ communities in the criminal legal system. Before we begin today's panel, we want to acknowledge that John Jay is based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor the indigenous nations and their lands with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon indigenous communities and people of color across the country, in particular that against Black communities, which inspires our ongoing work. And for that, I ask you to join me in a moment of silent acknowledgement. The content of today's discussion may be particularly sensitive, and we encourage listeners to step away from your devices as needed and do what's best for your mental health and well-being throughout the discussion. I am so honored to bring together some of the country's foremost leaders on the pressing questions facing prosecution today. I feel sure that if anyone can solve the racial injustice and mass incarceration that have plagued our profession since the very early days of the Republic, these people are amongst them. So I'm thrilled to introduce Commonwealth's attorney, Stephanie Morales. Stephanie Morales was the first woman to be elected Commonwealth's attorney in Portsmouth, Virginia, after which she immediately created sustainable programming aimed at reforming the criminal justice system, and it has been embraced by her community. She's committed her office to a community prosecution model focused on safety and procedural justice, including extensive youth and community outreach and prevention programs. District Attorney Chesa Boudin is the new district attorney of San Francisco, California. Personally impacted by parental incarceration and the failings of the criminal legal system, DA Boudin was inspired to become a public defender and now a decarceral prosecutor. He is focused on reforming the criminal justice system and making our communities safer by developing data-driven policies to expand alternatives to incarceration and treat the root causes of crime. Professor Paul Butler. Professor Butler researches and teaches in the areas of criminal law, race relations law, and critical theory at Georgetown Law School. Professor Butler is one of the nation's most frequently consulted scholars on issues of race and criminal justice. His scholarship has been the subject of much attention in both academic and popular media. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown Law, Professor Butler served as a federal prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice, where his specialty was public corruption. State's Attorney Sarah Fair George is the Chittenden County State's Attorney in Burlington, Vermont. For 6 years, County Attorney George served as Deputy State's Attorney in the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office. In January of 2017, she was appointed by the governor to become State's Attorney, and in 2018, she was elected to serve her first full term. Since being in the position, she has focused on ways to combat the opiate crisis, reform the criminal justice system, all the while strengthening public safety in her community. So we're going to start by jumping right in with this moment and looking to the future. Professor Butler, since unlike the other panelists, you have the luxury of looking at prosecution from the outside now. What, if anything, have you seen in the criminal legal system during COVID that you think shows promise for the future?
At least 16,000 people have come home from jail and prison. And not only is the sun still shining in the face of this decarceration, the sun is shining even more brightly. There haven't been any apparent increases in crime, and the decarceration hasn't been politically controversial, at least not on a national level. And so this is a way forward in terms of thinking about how to end mass incarceration. We've also seen the police drawing down, especially with regard to misdemeanor arrests, because they want to keep people safe during the pandemic. Now, there are obvious exceptions, like the high-profile case in in Minneapolis. But in general, what many police officers have understood is that this isn't a time to lock up everybody they can for every misdemeanor. And again, those decisions don't seem to have been politically controversial, and they don't seem to have led in any uptick in crime. And finally, we have reasons to be optimistic based on this multi-generational, racial coalition that's risen up in response to police violence. We're seeing people take seriously issues like the appropriate allocation of resources to police as opposed to other first responders. And we've also seen a serious national discourse about racial justice and policing.
Commonwealth Attorney Morales, given everything the professor has just laid out about what has changed in the course of COVID, what are some of your biggest takeaways as the elected DA during this pandemic that you plan to carry over into the future?
Thank you. So I will just have to acknowledge that as a member of this legal profession, it has become ever more evident that the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to incarcerate, but not to truly seek justice. And looking at what was happening when we first saw what was happening to our society. And I personally was approached by my public defender as soon as we started to think about what coronavirus would mean in incarceration. And we decided to partner together, not for us to sit by and not object to the motions to release people, but that we would come before the court on joint motions to try to do what was right by our incarcerated community members. But again, it became evident that as much as my office tries to be reform-minded and decarceral and everything that we feel really good about, that we try to term ourselves as, that we just have people who are incarcerated who are nonviolent. And that's just really not okay. We really have to, as a society, figure out why we are incarcerating people who now, because there's a public health pandemic, we can, find the energy and the time and the arguments to bring before the court to release these very members of our community who we incarcerated for one reason or another. But that reason could not have been because of our safety. So it is just, really highlighted the dysfunction between law enforcement, prosecutors, and the community at large, and highlighted the fact that as much as we try and as many efforts as we've taken, we have to do a better job at making sure that people understand that when cases come before them, it's not a case, it's not a file, it is a person, it's somebody's child, it's somebody's parent. And we have to do right by those members of our community who have come before us accused of crimes. And so I plan to continue to build on that relationship with the public defender where we're doing things jointly to try to get it right by our community. I plan to continue not to let up and to encourage my staff to remember this time and think about these moments every single time they're making a decision about somebody's life, because this is a matter of freedom. And oftentimes it really is a matter of life and death and the quality of a person's life. And so as we have grappled with this pandemic in our communities, I feel that we really have to embrace those who were accused as community members as well, and remember that they are people and that we have to make the right decisions. And it's a day-to-day commitment. We can't just make these sweeping statements. We have to commit on a day-to-day basis to trying to get this right and ensuring that, as Professor Butler put it, that the sun continues to shine brightly and that we understand that not incarcerating is not going to change that, but will indeed put us in a better position to succeed as a society.
Thank you. State's Attorney George, I know that you have been focused on many of the same kind of policy undertakings since COVID, but given that you also handle some of your own cases at the line level and were not so long ago a line assistant, I think that we're joined by a great number of line level prosecutors and public defenders in the audience. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you see these changes affecting the day-to-day practice of ordinary non-elected prosecutors and defense attorneys in your jurisdiction and beyond?
Thank you, Lucy. I would really echo a lot of what Commonwealth Attorney Morales stated around us recognizing that there's a lot more work that we all as progressive prosecutors like to think that we're doing it all right. And then when these moments come to us, we realize that even we can be doing better. And that has certainly happened in my staff in the last 3 months, where we have really felt like over the past years, we've been bringing less and less people into our court system and allowing restorative justice or other community partners to take on some of that load and take it off from us, and that we're not charging cases that aren't a priority. But when the pandemic hit and we all were tasked with going through every one of our cases and determining whether or not it was truly a priority, we ended up dismissing over 300 cases. And I think that that is a good reminder for all of us that we do still have a habit of charging things because at the time we think it's necessary or we think it's the right thing to do, especially to connect people with services, but that is not the way that we should be working with our community to connect people to services. So I think going forward, my staff at least, and myself included, are not bringing those cases at all and are instead putting it back on communities or putting it back on law enforcement or putting it back on social services to connect those people directly with the services that they need instead of going through our office at all. And it really highlighted for us that when we might have thought we were doing that, or we might have thought we were charging people for the right reasons, it really can't happen anymore. We really need to rely on communities to do some of that themselves so that we can prioritize more important cases with victims and harm, violence, those types of things.
DA Boudin, of course, you took office with a mandate to do many of these things just a few months before the pandemic hit. Did the pandemic impact the speed and effectiveness with which you were able to implement change? And what are you doing now to take that into account and move things forward?
Well, let me just start by thanking you for having me on this panel. It's an honor to be here with these other speakers, and I want to thank all the hosts for bringing us together to talk about these issues, which, as you said, have defined in many ways my whole life. I ran my campaign last year on a platform that focused on ending mass incarceration. That was my campaign platform because I understood through my own lived experience and my own professional experience as a public defender that our system of mass incarceration actually makes us less safe. It fails to prevent crime. It ignores the real needs of victims that all too often go unmet in our current approach. And it destroys families and communities at a tremendously high economic and social cost. What COVID-19 has made more clear than was clear even to me last year during my campaign is the ways in which mass incarceration also presents a very real public health danger and undermines public safety in that regard as well. We have seen, and we're in the midst of right now in California, a very severe outbreak of COVID-19 in one of our most well-known prisons, San Quentin, just a few miles away from where I'm speaking with you from now. We did, when COVID-19 broke out, we did in San Francisco what I wish the President of the United States would do today, would have done from the beginning. We listened to public health experts. The director of our jail medical team made it very clear that if we didn't act quickly and decisively and boldly to reduce the county jail population, we would be dealing with a widespread outbreak and unnecessary preventable deaths. And so my office sprung into action, and we reduced the jail population from peak to trough by over 45%. And the population has stabilized now down in the 40% range from when I first took office. We also, in the process of doing that, realized that there were a lot of people, as you've heard from the other panelists, there were a lot of people in our jail who didn't have to be there in the first place, who, being incarcerated was not going to rehabilitate them, was not going to make it less likely that they would get arrested once they were released. And in fact, there were some people where it was really unconscionable that they were incarcerated in the first place. We found one woman with a high-risk pregnancy with no criminal record who was serving time on a misdemeanor. And thanks to our partnership with the jail medical team, with the San Francisco pretrial diversion program, and with other reentry partners, we were able to find that woman and so many others effective, safe reentry plans where they could be released from jail, have somewhere to go, a shelter, food, the medical care they need, and not be in our expensive, inhumane jail system. It's also accelerated our efforts at bail reform. We saw statewide, the entire state of California followed an initiative that I've been leading for many years to end money bail. Every single county in the state for the last several months was required to have a zero bail policy for most nonviolent felonies and misdemeanors. And amazingly, to those who have defended the bail system, but no surprise to those of us who recognize its injustice, its inequity, and the ways in which money bail undermines public safety, with zero bail in place, crime rates continue to fall. Since shelter in place in San Francisco, for example, crime rates are now down approximately 35%. We don't need money bail, and we don't need mass incarceration to keep us safe.
Thank you. I want to explore the issue of race and prosecution, which I know is really top of mind for all of you, as it is for so many Americans right now. Professor Butler, you have famously written about the irreconcilable challenges, perhaps, of being a Black man and a prosecutor. What would you say to the Black prosecutors out there who are listening at this unprecedented moment? And then I'll ask State's Attorney Morales if you would respond to Professor Butler with your own thoughts.
I would say to African American and Latinx prosecutors, either be the boss or work for someone like one of the great prosecutors on this panel. After the progressive prosecution movement got launched with Professor Angela Jordan Davis's great work, it's been extremely successful. So in places like San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia, we've seen progressive district attorneys actually win. Sometimes the movement gets overstated. By my count, there are fewer than 50 self-avowed progressive prosecutors in a landscape of somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 elected prosecutors in this country. And what does it mean if you're not working for one of those 50? I think you have to take seriously what your responsibilities are. So we heard from Commonwealth Attorney Morales that the system's not broken. The system is working the way that it's supposed to. And so what does it mean in terms of your work if you're not the boss, or your boss isn't someone who specifically aligned with reducing incarceration and with ending race disparities? What would it mean if your boss doesn't have policies in place to accomplish those goals and metrics of their success? If you're not working for a progressive prosecutor and you're African American or Latinx person, you should quit. You don't tell me about your discretion. It's not going to work what you might be able to do on the slide or on the low down when your boss isn't looking. If she's not specifically on board, you're not going to be able to make the impact that you hope. And then you should ask yourself, did you go to law school to lock up Black people and Hispanic people in situations in which white folks don't get locked up? If the answer is no, and you're not working for a progressive prosecutor, then you should quit.
Commonwealth Attorney Morales?
That was like a mic drop. So I will say this. I feel that part of the problem with our profession is that we do not have representation from people who understand those who come before them. I am not a statistician by any means, but I have seen the statistic all over social media that Black people represent 5% of the legal profession, and that's not even talking about prosecution. And so we have to be real with ourselves that people have not been having the conversations that we're having now and acknowledging that there is systemic racism and there is institutional racism and inequity that goes on in this system on a daily basis. We've just not been having those conversations. People have wanted to be polite. People have not wanted to ruffle feathers. And that willingness to enjoy a collegial atmosphere with our counterparts has placed us in this very position where we now have to grapple with the reality of what's happening, and that is a life or death process for Black and brown people. And so I will not say quit. I started off as a line prosecutor. I was not happy with the situation. I was not working for a progressive, what would be considered a progressive prosecutor. When I ran for office in 2015, there was nothing that I heard of called a progressive prosecutor movement when I first got elected in February of 2015. And I say that to say, it's time for you to step up and lead. You know, it's time for you to step up and lead. And if you do find yourself in that position where you are stifled and you are forced to do something that you cannot stomach, you know, wholeness is critical as well. I don't think that enough emphasis has been placed on being whole as Black and brown people who have had to deal with so much throughout the courses of our lives to get to this point where we should leave wholeness out of the conversation. So if you are placed in a position where you are forced to do something where your values, you know, don't allow you to, it doesn't resonate with you, absolutely do what you need to do to be whole, because you cannot help anybody if you are not whole as a person. But I want every last Black and brown prosecutor, attorney within the sound of my voice to hear me when I say you are needed. You are needed because people in our communities need you. They need people who will understand their plight, people who will look at them and see a family member and not a miscreant. They will look at you and see, you know, you will look at them and see someone who is at their lowest point, who is in need of a person who will serve not only the quote unquote victim, but who will serve everybody. And that means those who are accused of crimes as well. And so I see this as a moment where we have to have a call to action, because we have to have the tough conversations. We cannot settle for incremental change. We need transformational system overhaul, and that is going to require leadership from Black and brown lawyers on the prosecution side. And I will also say this: if you are not a Black and brown lawyer and you don't have heartburn and you are not in a place where you can't stomach the things that are happening, you don't need to be a prosecutor either. And so if you don't feel some kind of way about racism, if you cannot acknowledge that there has been systemic inequity, then you should quit. And so this is not just about, you know, being a Black or brown person. We need people of all colors, all ages, and who have all different beliefs to stand up for what is correct and for what is right at this time. And if you can't do that, then I say you should quit.
Thank you. DA Boudin and State's Attorney George, what steps have your offices taken to address issues of race and prosecution that have been highlighted in recent weeks? And what do you talk to your line prosecutors about as an ally of precisely the kind of efforts that have just been described?
I'm happy to start. Thank you for the question. It's a critical issue. It's always been a relevant and significant and central part of my professional life as a public defender. And again, during my campaign last year, we were very focused on the racial inequities in the system. In San Francisco, for example, about 5% of the population is African American, and the jail is more than 50% Black on any given day. That has to change. And it was a mandate that I took seriously from day one. The last several weeks have given us impetus, and we've issued a whole flurry of policy announcements. I'll walk through just a few of them. First of all, we worked with our Board of Supervisors to sponsor a resolution that would prohibit the city from hiring police or sheriff's deputies with a history of misconduct or who had refused to cooperate with a prior investigation into serious misconduct. And that serious misconduct includes racial bias or discrimination. Second, We've begun the process of compiling a do not call list of police officers, other law enforcement, who we will not rely on to prove a case because of racial bias or other serious misconduct. We've also announced that we will, going forward, provide victims' compensation to victims of police violence, including medical, therapy, funeral expenses, burial expenses. We want to make sure that we're treating victims equally, even when they're victims of police misconduct and violence. We've also revamped and strengthened our team that focuses on prosecuting police use of violence. And we just yesterday or the day before had more than half our office, including non-lawyers, join me in taking a pledge to racial justice and racial equity, a commitment that our prosecutors will not just refuse to tolerate racism, but will be proactive and zealous in fighting against racism. We've done a number of other things, for example, insisting that before we charge resisting arrest or assault on officer cases, that we review body-worn camera footage, because we know that all too often those cases, those charges are presented to us with police reports that on their face sound like a legitimate, righteous assault on an officer case. But in some instances, those charges and those police reports are intended to cover up police violence and police misconduct. We're not going to be complicit any longer. And the way we're going to avoid it is by watching the footage and seeing for ourselves what actually happened. We've done a number of other things, but that gives you a sense of the steps we've taken. And we are proactively working on a range of other steps, from training to a racial justice committee within our office and more.
State's Attorney.
Thank you. So the very first thing that we did as an office was to meet, virtually, of course, and talk about and acknowledge the fact that our judicial system is built on systemic racism and systemic inequity. And that is something that I think we talk about generally, but to really sit down and sit with ourselves and talk about that, especially as District Attorney Boudin said, we are a state that is primarily white and have a very small population of Black and brown people, and yet they are a disproportionate amount of people in our prison system. So as prosecutors, as white prosecutors, to acknowledge that and to also acknowledge that we are a part of that problem is a very big and I think important first step. Then we committed to pulling and reviewing every single case in our county with a Black defendant and starting from scratch on a review of that case. From my perspective, one of the things that struck me in the last couple of weeks or months through all of the national attention was the Central Park case and the white woman who called the police on the Black male. And the reason that really struck me was to see her speaking to the police, screaming, and genuinely seeming scared. And that was striking to me because so much of our prosecutorial world is based on how people react or act on 911 calls, or when they interact with police. We have entire laws allowing us to bring those statements in because we assume that those statements are more truthful because they haven't had time to come up with an excuse or a lie. So to see that and know that she was lying really struck a lot of us hard. And that's why we decided that we really needed to go back and look at these cases from the very beginning, from the call, from the time police are even asked to come. And if there wasn't any corroborating evidence to what was being said, to dismiss the charge. We have also done a lot of similar things to what District Attorney Boudin was saying. We've done some policies around use of force. We're pushing legislature to do more statewide and talking about what charges we will or won't bring for what officers have misconduct in their histories. Those are some of the things that we've been doing, but I think that it's a really hard conversation for white prosecutors to have and to acknowledge, and we've done that. We've had really uncomfortable conversations, And I think that everybody is a better prosecutor for it going forward.
I'd love to delve more into the complex relationship between prosecutors and police. And Professor Butler, chokehold is sadly as relevant now as when you first wrote it. Is there anything that you have observed in the recent instances of officer-involved fatalities that you would add to or change in your thesis as set forth in that work? While we pass back Professor Butler, oh, we can now.
Okay, so I'm sorry about that. So chokehold says that reform isn't going to be enough to bring the transformation that we so desperately need. We didn't talk about reforming slavery. We talked about abolishing it. We didn't think about reforming the old Jim Crow. We understood we needed to abolish it. And so if we think only about reforming the new Jim Crow, we won't rise to this moment. That's too unambitious. And reform has a place, right? So there are common sense proposals in the Justice Act of 2020. That's the House bill, which would save lives. It would prevent the police from killing and beating up as many people as they do now. At the same time, we've seen in places like Minneapolis and Atlanta and Buffalo outrageous acts of police violence, and in some ways, even more incredibly, more outrageous acts of police violence in responding to protests about police brutality. In my mind, I always imagine a roll call where the sergeant tells the officers, okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be patrolling a rally about protests of police brutality. So let's try really hard not to be brutal, not to treat Black people differently. But it's almost as though the police just can't help themselves. So in places like Buffalo, we see them knock a 75-year-old man to the ground. In New York, we see officers drive two huge police vans into a crowd of protesters. In Atlanta, we see cops yank two college kids out of a car by breaking the window of their car and then shooting them with a stun gun. And so what this tells me is that the problem really is this warrior culture that President Obama's Commission on Policing decried about the environment in too many police departments. And in Buffalo and Atlanta and New York, we saw warriors on steroids. And the reform isn't going to work unless you change that culture. One of the ironies of what has happened in some of these high-profile cases is that these cops have been trained, right? So in Minneapolis, police officers are trained on the duty to intervene, to step up when they see one of their colleagues disobeying the law. And yet, not only did the three officers who observed Officer Clavin, not only those three officers who observed him put his knee on George Floyd's neck and press him to the ground until he died, not only did these three other officers not intervene, according to the prosecutor in Minneapolis, they aided and abetted Mr. Floyd's murder. Similarly, the officer who killed Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, he'd had hours of training, including training on how to de-escalate. But when Mr. Brooks said, if you're worried about my driving, I can just leave the car here and walk 2 blocks to my sister's house. That wasn't good enough for that officer. He still insisted on the arrest, which escalated to the tragic consequence of Mr. Brooks' death. And so at the end of the day, all of the reform, all of the training, all of the policy prescriptions aren't going to mean anything unless you change that warrior culture that's endemic in too many police departments across this country.
I want to explore a bit about what prosecutors can do around that cultural problem that you're identifying. The commonly used number is that over the past 15 years or so, about 1,000 people have been killed annually at the hands of law enforcement. And over the past 15 years, just over 100 of them have been prosecuted, and fewer than half of those have resulted in a conviction. Commonwealth Attorney Morales, you actually have successfully prosecuted a police officer. Oh, and I should add that it's worth noting that at least in New York City, as of just today, we are getting information from a draft report from the medical examiner's office that some of those numbers may in fact be significantly underreported. So it is worth a comprehensive investigation into what we really know about some of these interactions. But given the successful work that you've done on this issue, Commonwealth Attorney, and how closely you've worked with us at John Jay and a number of mothers and sisters who've lost loved ones to police violence, can you talk a little bit about what you see as the prosecutor's role in addressing the cultural problems that Professor Butler just pointed to?
So first of all, we have to call things what they are. And we have given so much deference to different professions that we work closely with, again, out of this desire to be polite or be friends. And we have not called things what they are. The reality is that we are seeing racism. We're seeing bias. We're seeing things that just honestly cannot be trained out of a person. You have to change hearts and minds in order to change these things. And it's not going to come from more resources thrown at law enforcement agencies for bias training and sensitivity training and all of these different things that we just need to ask the questions up front when we're evaluating people to determine whether or not they can be officers, when they're doing these personality assessments and lie detector tests. The question needs to be asked, do you not like Black people? Are you afraid of Black people? Because constantly we're hearing about people being in fear. Well, if you're scared, you don't need to be in law enforcement. And if you're scared and you're afraid, you don't need to be a top prosecutor who's charged with making decisions that really go to the heart of whether or not we can be safe in a society as Black and brown people. And so for me, I don't desire to please anybody but the people who I'm charged with serving, and that is my entire community. And so a lot of prosecutors see themselves as working hand in hand with law enforcement, and that's excellent, but you need to be working hand in hand just as closely, if not closer, with the members of your community. We have to see ourselves not as prosecutors, but as public servants. And that means we should be concerning ourselves with housing. We should be concerning ourselves with food insecurity. We should be concerning ourselves with education, because all of these different areas where we have seen systemic inequity are resulting in Black and brown children and people filtering through the criminal legal system and then being abused on the streets by people who are supposed to be serving and protecting them. And so part of the reason why I think there was success was not just because, I know how to prosecute cases, because that's what and let me just make a note there. All of us know how to prosecute cases, but then some prosecutors all of a sudden don't know how to prosecute anymore when it comes down to holding law enforcement accountable. And that's unacceptable. But it's not just because I understood how to prosecute cases, but it was because there was a desire to do what was right by the family, by the community, to find all the information. But then beyond that, we had a jury that was representative of the community. And so as prosecutors, a lot of us, we talk about public service, we talk about voting, but we don't spend time talking to our communities about how important it is to have members of the jury who represent the makeup of the community. And I don't know what our outcome would have been if we didn't have a jury that was representative of the makeup of the community, who could look at my 18-year-old victim, William Chapman II, and see him as a brother and a son, which is what he was. And so I could go on forever, but the bottom line is, until prosecutors see the members of their community as being just as important, if not more important, than the law enforcement members that they work with, we're not going to see progress. And until we have prosecutors who are unafraid and who are just as tired as all of us whose hearts collectively broke when we've seen the events that are going around the nation, we will not have the outcomes that we need. And it's just time that we talk about it, we call it what it is, and we come to grips with the fact that we have to root out racism, and we cannot train our way and resource our way out of this.
So thinking about how that fits into the spectrum of ideas that seem to be lumped into defunding the police, Before I ask the elected prosecutors some questions about implementation, I want to ask you, Professor Butler, to talk a bit about the relationship between abolition and defunding the police, whether you see those things as existing on a spectrum and in relation to each other, and are those, as stated policy goals, anathema to the role of a DA? So what would an abolitionist DA look like if there were one?
Recently, I had this sense of deja vu. Like I've had this conversation before, and then I remember, yeah, the people who I was talking to this about back in the day were cops who were all in. As prosecutors, we've all heard police officers say, man, we get called to do so much that we're not trained or equipped or supposed to do. So we know that when people call 911, most times it's because of a relationship crisis or an issue arising from addiction or homelessness, or it's somebody who's in a mental health crisis. And that the most appropriate first responders aren't people with guns and batons and the power to arrest. And so my police officer friends have helped me understand the importance of having trained professionals who are attendant to the specific nature of the emergency as responders. And when I think about prosecutors and their relationship to abolition, I think that the same values are in play. I've certainly heard correctional officers say, apart from my financial interest, I welcome the day that we go out of business. I welcome the day that this prison shuts down. Now, we're not there yet. My friends who work for prisons will hasten to add, but I look forward to that day. And so, as a kind of value, I think it's important for prosecutors to understand what abolition means. It doesn't mean opening every prison door tomorrow. Think of it as a process of gradual decarceration. I hope that they're familiar with the metrics. The Brennan Center says 40%. The ACLU says 50%. That is the number of people who could come home tomorrow with no cost to public safety. But I certainly understand that people who are progressive prosecutors like me root for the day that they go out of business. They root for the day that we approach public safety in ways other than locking human beings in cages.
So thinking about that as a goal and your positions to uniquely take that on as an aspiration, starting perhaps with State's Attorney George and then with Commonwealth Attorney Morales and then DA Boudin, if you could talk a bit about, because this panel is on the future of prosecution, imagine what's on the other side of that aspiration.
Yeah, I mean, I tell my staff all the time when I talk to them about new policies that I'm working on or cases we're not going to prosecute, or when we were talking about the COVID, going through our cases and dismissing all these cases, hundreds and hundreds of cases overall that we dismissed. If you have concerns about, there was concerns about them losing their jobs, frankly, and that's when we're in a pandemic and our budgets are being cut. I am very clear with them, and I have been since I've been in charge, that we should all be working every day to put ourselves out of work. And I know that that's a hard thing to hear from a boss, but that is my goal. My goal is for them to not have any work, for none of us to have any work. And so that's, I think, that is the goal of all of us. That's the goal for police too. And I think that, or it should be the goal for police. And I think the more that we think about it in that way, that we shouldn't be necessary, that there should be less of us and less need for us, the better our system is going to be.
Commonwealth Attorney?
So I have to be honest with you. We have so much work to do, and it's hard for me to jump forward without thinking about the work. I think there's too much talking, not enough doing. And this, again, we have tried this incremental change and it's not worked. It's gotten us to this point. And so I can't discuss a future without talking about the work. So I think the work looks like all of us working together. And that's, very cute. A lot of people love to talk about togetherness, but I don't see a lot of prosecutors talking to the directors of their housing authorities, trying to get them to repeal policies that have arbitrary waiting lists for people who are coming and reentering back into the community. I don't see, prosecutors jumping into the schools and the education piece to make sure that young people are understanding what the laws are and that we don't have a school to prison pipeline issue. I think, again, food insecurity, thinking as prosecutors about how we provide resources and make sure that we don't have food deserts and make sure that young people aren't going to school hungry and can't pay attention and getting off track. And so, yes, I would love to end up in a place where social workers are responding to mental health crises, where young people their bellies are full, they're able to go get their education. There are no school resource officers to make them feel like they're surveilled. Our communities have built intergenerational wealth. All of the things that as a society we would like to have for Black and Brown communities when we can eradicate the systemic inequities that exist. And so I think we all can think about what this utopia is, but many of us experience a day where we go to work, we come home, we play with our children, we eat our food, we sit in our air conditioner, we drive around, and everybody does not experience that. That is not what everybody knows to be true. That is not the experience that everybody has. We don't see police in our neighborhood unless they're there to wave at us and let us know that we're safe and protected. That's the reality that I want for everybody. These are the things that everybody deserves, and we deserve not just to live, because we're talking about life or death, but Black and Brown communities, and just like everybody does, deserves to thrive. And so that's what I see. I see all of us living. I see all of us thriving, but I cannot talk about that, discuss that, or think about that without acknowledging the work that has to be done and the cooperation that has to be done and the fight that we have to feel on a daily basis to make these connections, to try to really realize this dream for all of us, and especially for those who have no voice to speak for themselves.
Before I put the question to DA Boudin, I want to invite listeners to put any questions you may have into the question and answer bar on the side of your screen, and I will put them to the panelists as they come in if we have time. DA Boudin, thinking about this aspiration that's been laid out, we at the IIP spent a lot of time studying the progressive prosecutors and other prosecutors and whether it's better for someone to come from inside an office or outside an office in order to make change. Coming from the defense bar, do you think that made it harder or easier for you to lay out the agenda you've laid out? And how has that worked with respect to implementing the kind of work that Commonwealth Attorney Morales just described?
Let me start by echoing a lot of the comments that Professor Butler, Commonwealth Attorney Morales, and State's Attorney Sarah George made. I mean, these are really important points, and I share their views in large part. Being a former defense attorney was a huge asset when I took office. It may have been a liability during the campaign, but once I took office, it was a huge asset because it gave me insight into the particular lawyers that we're negotiating cases with. It gave me insight into the particular judges and the juries. I had done dozens of jury trials in front of San Francisco judges and San Francisco juries. I knew the police officers who were problematic, and I knew the ones who went above and beyond for their communities. I knew which defense lawyers we could count on to help provide reentry planning and mitigation. And I also knew what the problems were in my own office because I'd been on the other side of those problems. It made it really easy for me to focus in a neutral and kind of with an outsider's mentality on what changes needed to be implemented and on what it would look like as a practical matter on the ground in cases every day in court if we could effectuate those changes. So we did things, I mentioned bail reform and others, but we did things like stopped redacting police reports in ways that went way beyond what the statute in California provides for, to give defense attorneys a fair chance to investigate their cases. We did things like around police culture we were talking about earlier. We made a public policy decision that we would not charge cases stemming from pretextual traffic stops. If they're contraband-only cases, drug possession, or even in those cases where weapons are seized, we're not going to incentivize or reward racist policing. And that means we'll seize the contraband, we'll destroy it, but we're not going to prosecute those cases. My perspective as a defense attorney was really important to those policy changes because I knew that it wasn't just discriminatory, it wasn't just exacerbating the statistics around racial bias, it was also undermining trust in communities and law enforcement. I saw that communities in San Francisco, housing projects, and mostly Black and brown communities were being policed in a way that felt to especially young men like they were living in a war zone, like they were being occupied by an army, rather than the kind of policing that Commonwealth Attorney Morales described that many people with more privilege or whiter skin experience on a daily basis. Having represented so many people who've been through that, I understood both because of my practice as a public defender and my lifetime of visiting my parents in prison, and my father who's still incarcerated, that there's real humanity in the individuals that are being prosecuted and in the families that love and support them. And we're going to be safer if we recognize that, and if we lead with the recognition that every single person we prosecute, with very few exceptions, is going to be released back to their communities. The sooner and the healthier and the safer and the stronger we can make that reentry programming, if we're focused on that from the beginning, we're all going to be safer.
We're going to ask a couple of lightning round questions before we wrap up. So one sentence or so answers. The term progressive prosecutor has people on the left kind of clamoring to be anointed as such. Starting with Professor Butler, is that still a useful term? What does it mean? Should we be thinking about a different framework if we are looking at abolition and some of the things we've been discussing today as the aspirations for the future of the movement?
Progressive prosecutors haven't jumped the shark, but that question, Lucy, has jumped the shark. The reality is most Americans aren't aware or don't understand what the progressive prosecutor movement is all about. So I think we have a long way to go with the leaders in this panel and other progressive prosecutors of helping everybody understand that you're on the front lines and you understand the ravages of mass incarceration and the vast racial inequities. People listen to you guys in a way that they don't listen to us activists and scholars.
Commonwealth Attorney.
I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it. I think it's an identifier so that, that's good. That, people are identifying themselves as progressive prosecutors, but the reality is you got to live up to it. And, everybody has adopted, a lot of people have adopted that label to try to make sure that they win if they're up for election or to try to stay in office. But the bottom line is if you're not living up to it, if you're not reform minded, if you're not fighting for racial equity, if you're not doing what your community needs, then we will see you, and hopefully communities will see you. And so I think it's played out that people are now using it in that way, but the identifier is important for those who are truly reform minded and progressive prosecutors.
State's Attorney George.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo what was just said, and I would add that I think it's incredibly frustrating to see so many people campaigning on a progressive platform and saying all of the right things, and then getting into office and not actually doing it, because the doing it is the very hard part in some ways. That's where you get all of the pushback. And there's just way too many that aren't actually following through on that word. And it hurts the entire movement when that happens.
Boudin?
I agree. It's a term that has become so popular as to in some ways become meaningless. We need to make sure that people who want to call themselves progressive are really progressive and that they're moving a progressive decarceral agenda. As my friend Tiffany Caban said during her campaign for Queens District Attorney, it's progressive prosecutor is not just about calling yourself progressive or about being a member of the Democratic Party. It's about having a mission that recognizes we are safer when we reduce the number of people who are incarcerated, when we reduce the footprint of mass incarceration. That's how we build safety. And if you're not in line with that vision, then you're not really a progressive prosecutor.
Before we conclude, I'm going to ask each of you, starting with State's Attorney George, then D.A. Boudin, Commonwealth Attorney Morales, and then Professor Butler, what is one realizable policy wish that you have for the next year in American criminal justice?
A new United States Attorney General who cares about laws and justice as it relates to actual research and data and humanity and morals rather than what we currently have.
That's hard to beat, but I'm going to keep it simple. I would end money bail.
Next. I think that's a yes. All right. I would say I have seen, there's too much to just pick one. Again, we need overhaul of this entire system and complete transformation. But if I had to say one thing that would characterize what that change would look like, I've seen jurisdictions all around the country declare racism a public health emergency. And I would like to see our legal system declare racism a judicial emergency. I think that would be a start at acknowledging, confronting what the problem is, and that's systemic racism. And that would be really the bedrock of beginning to form a new system for all of us who so desperately need it.
There are 18,000 different police departments in the United States and 18,000 different ways of policing. My goal would be national standards on issues like competency and use of force.
Well, thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you to the audience. I hope you found this hour as inspiring and exciting as I have. I hope you'll all keep your eyes on these outstanding leaders coming from different jurisdictions to see how they achieve those policy wishes they have laid out. And I hope that all of us can work together to get there. So on behalf of John Jay and the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, thank you to CAP for putting this together, to the audience for being with us, and to all of these outstanding panelists. Everyone be safe and healthy. And next year, I hope we'll be in person at John Jay.